Hello, hello. So today I'm going to be talking about essay number one, the questions for essay number one, and going over how I would approach each question and giving you guys some evidence and some quotes that I would use, to back up my answers to the questions. So that's what we're going to be doing. So here are the questions laid out for you. You have four options. I'm going to be going through them one by one, so I'll just read them as we go along, but this is just so you have them in one place. And before we start, I'm pretty sure every essay will need to use three quotes from the readings. And again, the readings will change depending on your question. And I'm pretty sure every essay has to have a thesis. Professor Solinger, if you're playing this in class, which I assume you are, please pause the video and clarify. I think every essay has to have a thesis because question number 3 is talking about symbolism. And I could see that being a more like book report style essay where you're just kind of stating facts and referring to the text. But typically the classes, in 101, you've always had to have a thesis. I assume you still have to have a thesis. So I think that's still the standard. But again, please clarify, Professor. But because you can mix and match readings for some of the questions, you might go a completely different route than I did, and that's okay. You're just making connections that I didn't. That's good, right? I just want to give you guys evidence and thoughts to give you examples of how I would approach any of the given questions, and ideally by the end of this, presentation, you will have an idea of which question you want to answer, because we're going to be talking about them in a decent amount of depth. And then some final notes. Rough draft, 500 to 750 words. Final draft, 750 to 1,000. MLA citations, Times New Roman, 12-point font, double-spaced, heading, all that jazz. We'll talk about that, or maybe you already have. But we're going to dive into the questions. So question number 1. So narrative is the telling of a story, and point of view is the perspective from which a story is told. How does the way the narrator tells the story and the point of view through which they tell it fundamentally affect our experience of reading any or all of the following stories? Wait, the children last, what's expected of us, the knowers, and or there will come soft rains. So it's a long question. So I'll break it down into two parts. Basically, it's how does narration affect our experience of reading the story? And how does point of view affect our experience of reading the story, right? Because again, those are two different things. And then you would talk about in your essay those things for one or all or a selection of those four stories, right? I don't even know if you could. I don't think it's possible to do narration and point of view for four stories in under 1,000 words. If you can, like, I don't. You should be teaching this class. So yeah, I would say like choose one, maybe two of the stories, and then talk about that. So again, your answer, to the question will depend on which readings you pick. But an example of how, point of view and how narration affects the stories is in class, we were very focused on who the narrator of Wait, the Children Last was, right? Some people were like, oh, we think it's patient D. Some people were like, we think it's somebody on the medical team, right? We talked about it for like 45 minutes. I think that line of questioning was only so interesting because the author chose to narrate the story, or the point of view of the story, more specifically, was in first person, right? But a very careful use of first person. So the point of view here affects our experience of it because they could have easily chosen to make it in third person, but because they slipped in a few we's, because they slipped in I at the very end, all of a sudden our experience and our understanding of the story changes. So again, here's how I would approach it. I would probably choose one story because narration and point of view are two different things. I would probably choose Wait, the Children Last, and then just come up with ways that narration and point of view affect that story. And that's what I would discuss. I would do narration for one body paragraph, point of view for another body paragraph. And usually four paragraphs in total. So you'd have intro, two body paragraphs, conclusion is okay as long as you're still hitting the word count. And then that's what I would do. And you could also, again, choose multiple stories and just focus on like one story for each of your body paragraphs. It's just that I would only choose one because there's enough to talk about there. But if you want to, choose a few and, go for that. And here's evidence or like some quotes that I would use to back up my claims here. So we just talked about We Ate the Children Last, but I'll talk about like the knowers, right? Here the point of view really affects how we understand the story, right? The first person makes us feel like we are Ellie, the I in the story. And it's the use of I that makes us realize there are two people in this world, right? So the quote I have is, I would have preferred to be like Tem. Of course I would have. So there's I's, there's people who are like I in the story, and then there's people like other people like Tem, right? So there's us and there's people like Tem. It creates a divide, right? We'll also get into this when it comes to the title, because the title also implies there's the knowers and there's the unknowers, the people who don't know, right? So that's a very clear way that we can see how the narration, or the point of view more specifically, is affecting how we experience the story, right? You could also talk about empathy. We empathize a lot more with this character because of first person, right? Because we are taking on the I in the story as we read it. When it comes to There Will Come Soft Rains, it's more about narration. So the quote I chose was, 2 o'clock, sang a voice, delicately sensing decay at last. The regiments of mice hummed out as softly as blown gray leaves in an electrical wind. 2:15, the dog was gone. So the repetition and the odd line breaks would make me believe, personally, like the author is a poet or a fan of poetry. I mean, they include a poem in the story. And this can be inferred and understood through how the story is narrated, right? So how it's being told, how the time is a really big element, and how it's broken into like really small paragraphs. The way the story is narrated helps us experience it and understand it differently. It almost reads like a poem, right? The whole story, which is a much different experience than reading something like The Knowers, where it just kind of reads as like a short story, right? So yes, moving on to question number 2. Authors have an infinite number of options when it comes to giving titles to their works. What is the significance of the title in any or all of the following stories? Wait the Children Last, Obad, The Knowers, and or There Will Come Soft Rains. So again, your answer depends on which readings you choose, but you should know that all of the titles allude to themes or concepts presented in the stories, right? So some are explicit, we ate the children last, but also implicit, because they never say, oh, we ate the children, right? But it's understood by the end of the story, oh, they ate the children last, right? So here's how I would approach the question. So I'd probably choose one of the readings, maybe two, and figure out as many ways that the title applies to that story as possible. So for example, in There Will Come Soft Rains, it's a double entendre, maybe a triple entendre, maybe you could find another meaning, but a double entendre just means it has two meanings, right? So one meaning is that it refers to a poem that is told within the story by Sarah Teasdale that's titled There Will Come Soft Rains, right? It also refers to the idea or the mere fact that no matter what happens in this world, how much destruction or chaos or technology, how much that destroys it, in the end, nature will take its course, and ultimately, there will come soft rains. There will come hard rains. There will come no rain, right? Like, it's alluding to this idea that nature will run its course, and in the end, it doesn't really matter, right? So yeah. You could also do this by thinking about what the title implies about the story. So what does the knowers imply? Perhaps, again, the unknowers, the unknown, the people who don't know, the people not know, right? So it creates this dichotomy, right? It creates the knowers, the I, Ellie. It creates the unknowers, the Thames, the people who don't want to know, right? And that affects the story, right? Or that is like a significance within the story. I'm like trying to remember what the question was. So yeah, you could do this for all the stories. Remember, Professor chose them carefully because each title has its own unique relationship to the story's themes. So pick a story that you can find the most relationships between the actual content of the story and the title and run with that. Yeah, moving on. Question number 3. A symbol is anything that represents or stands in for something else. What are the main symbols and what do they represent in either or both of the following stories? A fable with slips of blah 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 blah, what's expected of us, and Obad. Why do the authors use these symbols and what do they add to the stories? So, here's how I would approach the question. I'm going to focus on, for this one, a fable with slips, because the symbolism is more explicit and there are more symbols, at least that I could find. But again, there are symbols for all of them. So, in this story, the slips of paper are like, explicitly prayers, right? They're said to be prayers. But they're also a symbol of like a relinquishing of responsibility. Not all of them are, but quite a few of them are. Like, for example, the quote, "Please help me figure out what to do about Albert," or "Don't let my nerves get the better of me this afternoon." These are prayers, but they're also things that these people, the people who are praying could figure out on their own, right? They could just ruminate and think about what they could do with Albert or about Albert. They could, harden their nerves or work on their, their confidence and, make sure that they're not, getting anxious in the afternoon. These are things that these people could take on, but they relinquish that responsibility by praying, to God or to this person with the coat. God himself is a symbol in the story. He's kind of a stand-in for like human nature or behavior. He literally says like, "It's yours now. I don't want the responsibility anymore," when he's talking about the coat. And he says, "I came to understand the limitations of my character." So he's kind of showing that even God, right, no one person can take on all the problems of the entire world, right? So he's just like anybody else. He's just another person. The coat is also a symbol, and it's a symbol of compassion or empathy. Even after he lost the coat, right, he was left with a lingering sensitivity to the currents of hope and longing that flowed through the air, right? There's also the quote about him being able to sense other people's thoughts, like he's an empath or sense other people's feelings, right? He just knows what people are thinking. But it's true, right? He gets the coat and he starts to like feel these sorts of. He starts to understand people better, right? He starts to understand how people are how he could help people and how he can make somebody's day a little bit better by just complimenting them or something like that. So the coat is kind of a symbol for compassion or empathy. Then there's other symbols for Obad and symbols for what's expected of us. For the sake of time, I'm just going to move on, but you can pause and read them or explain them, Professor. Question number 4. In both the knowers and what's expected of us, humanity is met with hard, inescapable truths, namely how everything is predetermined and predestined. What do these stories suggest is the proper way to be in the face of such painful knowledge? How should we live? Heavy question, right? Everything is predetermined. What matters? How should we live? You know? But this is kind of answered, right, by that video that we watched in class, which could be summarized by free will does not exist, but we are better off pretending that it does. So you can think of, if you can think of another answer to this question, go for it. That's not, this. Just make sure you're able to find evidence for it. So if you're like, oh, free will does exist. In fact, it says it in the story right here. Like, go ahead and try to argue that. But I would say that this is probably the answer for most of the essays, or for the evidence that we're being given. So I would make this my thesis. I would say, through these stories, we come to understand that free will is a fallacy. Yet, we are better off pretending that it is real anyways, because otherwise we risk falling into despair. So the evidence that I would use to support this from the knowers is, on the morning of April 17th, 2043, I was half amazed to open my eyes to the light. 6 hours and 4 minutes into the day, and I was alive, petrified, scared to move even a muscle. I wondered how death would come for me. So here, right, we can see that this character doesn't have free will. They are, right, and I would explain this, that they know when their death is coming, and that the understanding that free will is a fallacy has literally petrified them. It says it right there. So if this character was able to pretend that they did have it, maybe they would be able to get up in the morning, right, and move, right? Which is surely better than just waiting for death. And then in what's expected of us, I found the reality isn't important. What's important is your belief, and believing the lie is the only way to avoid a waking coma. Civilization now depends on self-perception. Perhaps it always has. Again, I think it's pretty explicit of how this quote relates to the question. We just have to deceive ourselves into believing that everything is going to work out. So yeah, if I were you, I would really take my time choosing the question. The question is going to be the most important. Even if it's going to be harder for you to answer, if you find it more interesting, I would choose the one that you find more interesting. And yeah, I'm trying to think of any last thoughts, ideas, but I don't want to take up too much time if I can't even think of anything. So I'll just say good luck. If you have a thesis that you want to send to me, Professor Solinger, and say, hey, will you take a look at this? Does this look good? If you have evidence that you're like, does this work with my thesis? You can always email that to me, or to Professor Solinger. And I look forward to seeing your guys' essays. All right, I will see you in class. Goodbye for now.